Hello and welcome everybody to this amazing, powerful and educational Lunch and Learn. And on behalf of family partners, I just want to thank each one of you for being here with us. And I also want to remind you that this Lunch and Learn is brought to you by family partners of Florida and Sussex counties. This is your host, Patricia Houston, and today is joining me, clinical psychology and program manager, Meghan Freehan. Welcome, Meghan.
Thank you.
So Meghan is here from the Pediatric Eating Disorder Center at Atlantic Health System. And today we are going to have a conversation about their services and resources. So we're going to start right now. So Meghan, tell us a little bit, what is the Pediatric Eating Disorder Center at Atlantic Health System?
Sure. So the Pediatric Eating Disorder Center is a center that's located at Overlook Medical Center in Summit, New Jersey. It is part of Goriev Children's Hospital of Morristown, and we fall under the umbrella of Atlantic Health System. And so what we are is really an outpatient service, but we provide various levels of care. So starting from the base point, we do assessments for individuals who there's a suspected eating disorder. We do comprehensive assessments involving the medical team as well as the therapeutic team in order to offer diagnosis and recommendations. And that's for consultation purposes. So some people we might refer to other services in the community, but a lot of people then stay within our system as well. So what we provide here is we have a day treatment program. It's known as a PHP, partial hospitalization program, for our most medically compromised children. And they are here for about 40 hours a week. And they receive therapeutic services as well as medical support while getting treated for their eating disorder. We also provide outpatient treatment. So patients can receive therapy, family treatment, counseling, psychiatry, a variety of services in order to help their eating disorder. And usually patients who meet that criteria are medically stable in order to be able to participate in that type of treatment. We are exclusively an adolescent pediatric program, which means we treat children and adolescents ages 8 to 21.
Awesome. Thank you for that information. And now that we're discussing about, the services that you guys have, can you please tell us a little bit about eating disorders?
Yeah. So broadly speaking, eating disorders are biologically based but curable mental illnesses. So I'm going to speak to each of those sort of in part. So a lot of times when parents or families first come to us, the first thing that they want to know is why? How did this happen? And so, what we like to share with families is that these illnesses have a strong genetic component to them. There is specifically differences in the brain, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, in individuals who are afflicted with these illnesses. And so it's not necessarily I think when we think about eating disorders, we think about causal factors such as social media and, perhaps trauma. And that's not necessarily the case. What we know is that there is a specific personality constellation that renders certain individuals vulnerable. We also know that malnutrition, being not eating enough, also brings forth a lot of the symptoms that we see in eating disorders. The other piece that I mentioned to this is that there are curable illnesses. And so I think I really like to highlight that, because how often can you say that for mental illness? Most mental illnesses you manage. You learn how to manage, but for eating disorders, it is something that they are treatable and they are curable.
And Meghan, let's go over the different type of eating disorders that,
Sure. So, the first eating disorder is anorexia nervosa. So I think probably people are pretty familiar with this. So anorexia nervosa actually involves a restriction of energy needs relative to what one's body needs. So simply stated, an individual is limiting either the amount and or type of food that they are taking in. And as a result, it is leading them to perhaps be medically unstable or have significant weight loss, which then leads to medical instability. There is an inability to gain weight or behavior that interferes with gaining weight. So even though some of these individuals might state that they're willing to gain weight, they're not able to make the changes necessary in order to regain the weight. And then finally, we see that there's often a body image component. It's pretty broad, this last criteria. So some individuals have a negative body image. But more often than not, what we see is a disturbance in the way that they view themselves. So this is known as body image distortion. They do not see their bodies accurately. And what we also see in one of the other criteria is that a lot of these individuals do not recognize the seriousness of their illness. So despite the fact that they are significantly underweight, they don't see it as a problem. And therefore, for these individuals, it's often very hard to get them engaged in treatment. Next, we have bulimia nervosa. And so bulimia nervosa involves engaging in binge eating. So binge eating essentially means eating a large amount of food in one sitting and feeling a loss of control at the time, followed by some sort of method to compensate and to try to expel the calories that were taken in. So I think when people hear bulimia, typically they think of vomiting after eating a large amount of food. Yes, that can absolutely be the presentation. However, individuals can also exercise excessively to try to get rid of the unwanted calories. They might engage in laxative use or diet pill use. So in order to be diagnosed with that, you need to have engaged in one of these episodes per week over the period of 3 months. And really the diagnoses between bulimia and anorexia, it's important to note that you can only have one diagnosis at the time. So we really look for what are kind of the predominating symptoms at the time, and that's the diagnosis that the individual would receive. When you don't fall kind of nicely into either one of those categories, meaning that an individual may have lost some weight, but it's not really a large amount of weight yet, or they're in what we call prodromal. They're just starting to develop their eating disorder. There is a general sort of catch-all category, which is known as OSFED, or otherwise specified feeding and eating disorder. And then I will talk just briefly about the two other diagnoses as well. So what we see a lot of here as well is a diagnosis known as ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And so this is a relatively new diagnosis that's come about in the past 8 years or so. So what happens is an individual with ARFID is restricting their intake, but they're doing it not for any purposes that have to do with body image. So these individuals will either be extremely picky eaters. And when I say picky, I mean not your typical 5-year-old who only wants chicken fingers and French fries at dinner. These kids have a very narrow repertoire of perhaps 5 or 6 foods that they eat regularly. And for them, what happens is it results in failure to grow, failure to gain weight, and perhaps even some medical complications. Also under this diagnosis are those individuals who have an aversive consequence from eating. And so therefore they're afraid to eat. So what I mean by that is these are your kids who had perhaps a choking episode and now they're afraid to eat, or they had a vomiting episode or saw someone vomit and now are limiting their intake because they don't want that thing to happen. So these kids, so again, the key feature here is that it results in nutritional deficiencies and also failure to gain weight oftentimes, or failure to grow. And it's impairing, their function is impaired. I can't go to a party because I can't eat anything there that's served at the party. So that's really the key features here. And then finally, we have binge eating disorder. So binge eating disorder is eating objectively a large amount of food in one sitting and feeling a loss of control at the time.
Megan, I know that you just touched base it in relation to the symptoms or signs that you can see that you see out there.
Mhm.
Are there additional signs and symptoms that we should be looking for?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that specifically when it comes to anorexia and bulimia, a lot of the symptom presentation is somewhat similar. So, first, I'll start with the psychological aspect of the illness. So, psychologically speaking, these individuals um, tend to become more withdrawn and isolative. And some of that is a direct result of the fact that they are there's some increase in depressive symptoms. But some of it is just a fear of eating with friends or eating in public. So these individuals will start to withdraw. They'll withdraw from often their friend groups, they'll withdraw from their family, and they might not want to be eating in public settings. Additionally, oftentimes there is an obsessionality about food. So these individuals might all of a sudden take great interest in cooking or baking, not necessarily that they might be eating it themselves, but that all of a sudden they're researching recipes and what have you. Um, a lot of times, like I said, you'll notice mood changes. Most of the parents that we see will describe their kids in one word, which is irritable. Um, Easily sort of triggered, easily frustrated, increasing irritability. We do tend to see some concentration difficulties, although these kids will still do really well in school. So you might not notice it there. It's just for them, it might actually take them a lot longer to be able to do as well as they used to. And just a general lack of interest in things that used to interest them. Um, so as far as the difference between, I guess, bulimia and anorexia, the symptoms that you might see is whereas a patient with anorexia might not eat as much in a public setting or might make excuses or might say, I already ate today. Individuals with bulimia, you might observe that there's more frequent bathroom use after meals. Parents have definitely found evidence of wrappers in the room or bags of vomit in the room. So there might be some more overt evidence of specifically the purging behaviors. When it comes to medical symptoms, so for anorexia, you will notice that there is oftentimes a rapid weight loss, whereas bulimia, that's not as apparent. So those individuals tend to fluctuate weight because of the binging component. For individuals who have anorexia, they're often cold all the time. So a lot of people, I think back, in the day thought that these kids wore these baggy clothes to cover up their body. And it's really more that these kids are wearing these clothes because they're cold. So even in the summer, they're wearing sweatshirts and sweatpants and what have you. So feeling cold all the time. Both diagnoses, feeling dizzy, feeling lightheaded, fainting episodes. So those are some of the key things to look out for.
And Megan, what can you tell us about, some of the biological roots of these illnesses?
Yeah. So as I alluded to before, that really these illnesses are biologically based, meaning that there is some genetic component that predisposes these individuals. Oftentimes we will see that individuals with eating disorders have a first degree relative that also has suffered from an eating disorder, not always, but often. So what we know is that these individuals tend to have a specific personality constellation, a group of personality traits that are common. These individuals tend to be perfectionistic, high achieving, rigid, people pleasers who want to really do well. Mm-hmm. And we also know, as I discussed briefly before, that malnutrition, not taking in enough food, results in severe changes in both the structure of the brain and the chemistry of the brain. So we actually know this by a famous experiment that was done in the 1940s, which is known as the Minnesota starvation experiment. And what they did is they recruited 36 subjects, they put them on a starvation diet, and basically said, let's see what happens. And what happens is that all these 36 men developed the symptoms that we see in anorexia. They developed the physical symptoms as well as the psychological symptoms. So putting those two pieces together, what we know is that anyone if they were put in the condition where they were not able to have access to food or were in starvation, would develop symptoms similar to what we see in anorexia. However, those subjects in that experiment didn't have access to food, whereas an individual who develops an eating disorder does have access to food. And that's where that key difference comes in the personality traits. So if I'm someone who goes on a diet, and then maybe 2 weeks into my diet, I'm at a party, I see a donut, there goes the diet, okay? But these individuals, it's a little bit different. So they have gotten a message somewhere that certain foods are not okay to take in, or they just maybe want to eat a little more healthy. And that's kind of how most people go into it. But what happens is after 2 weeks, they're at a party and they see that donut, they're not going to eat it. And so what happens is over time, it just becomes more restrictive and they're following their rules that they shouldn't eat certain foods. And eventually that malnourishment piece kicks in where they're really unable to get out of it themselves.
Thank you very much for that information, Megan. So you just based it in relation to the different eating disorders, also the signs and symptoms that we should be looking for. And in addition to that, you also went over just right now about the biological roots of these illnesses. But what can you tell us about, not only eating disorders, but what can we do to prevent eating disorders?
Yeah. So I think the key thing for prevention is having a really healthy attitude in the home about food in general. So studies have shown that when you limit what is in the household, meaning I don't allow any junk food at all in my house, I don't, no sugar foods, what have you, individuals tend to go overboard when they have access to it. And this creates a really unhealthy attitude towards food. So we like to say that all foods fit, to not label foods good or bad, that everything is okay in moderation. So, really communicating that, I think is key for families and having kind of that balance. Again, anything in moderation is okay. And so making sure that that balance is there. And I think really focusing less on body shape, size, and just being mindful of the comments that we make as adults, because little ears pick up on all of that. And so I think just, the language that we use to describe people and the language even that we use to describe our kids, focusing on what their strengths and skills and abilities are and not focusing on body shape and size. Obviously social media, I think, is a big, it's got a bad rap lately, and perhaps rightly so. But I think that just understanding what your kids are on and what they're viewing, because again, I say that if social media caused eating disorders, we'd all be walking around with eating disorders. A certain person is more susceptible to that. So I think just being aware of the messages that your kids are receiving on social media, and I do believe in limiting it as much as possible.
And we hear a lot of things about eating disorders from different people, and like everybody has different perception in relation to eating disorders. Mm-hmm. But you, because you are in the field eating disorders, what are some of those little myths that you hear out there that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So I think the number one thing that I hear is that eating disorders are a choice. Even the individuals that we treat feel like this was their choice. And if they didn't start to diet, then they never would be here. And what I tell them, again, is like we talked about, dieting is something that is part of our culture, like it or not. And most individuals have gone on a diet at some point in their life. So it's not that they did anything that was sort of that aberrant, it was that they made a decision to change their eating, but they couldn't have known that their biology would have set them up for them to spiral down this path. So I guess just understanding that this is not something these kids want. It's not volitional. They're not choosing not to eat. It's that their brains are literally telling them that they can't eat once they've crossed over into that point. I think understanding that there are many populations that we might not typically identify as at risk that are. So again, I said we go down to ages 8, and we have had 8-year-olds in our center. Absolutely. And so we also treat males in our center, and I would say the ratio is about 1 to 4. And also, understanding that just because an individual might be at a normal weight or even overweight does not mean that they don't have an eating disorder. We can't think of it as just an illness that is those people that appear thin. And I think, finally, really understanding that this is an illness that requires intervention. And again, because there's multiple components that are involved in treatment that include nourishment and also therapeutic support, and really relying on the experts to help parents navigate the best treatment for their child.
Thank you, Megan, for that information. And I know you are giving us valuable information about, the disorder and all of that. How can people get involved with the Pediatric Eating Disorder Center?
Yeah, so I posted our number in the chat. So that is the main number that is for intakes. So if you are concerned that your child is suffering from an eating disorder, the first step is to contact that number, and we do a phone assessment. So our phone assessment, basically then I'm the director of the program. And so I review all the assessments that come in, and we make sure that, even if we think, hey, everything seems okay, we want to let you know that. And so we review the phone assessments. If we think that a child needs to be evaluated, we will set you up with an assessment at our facility, again, with a physician and with a therapist, in order to make the best recommendations. And that also goes to providers in the community as well. If you suspect that someone you're working with has an eating disorder, or it's kind of beyond your scope, obviously we would work to with you in order to make the best possible recommendations for their care. So calling the number is the way to start.
Yeah, and I also want to remind everybody that Megan's contact information will be right below the video, and also the website. All that information is going to be right there. And Megan, everybody like to know, like, timeline, how long it's going to take, all of that. Can you tell us a little bit the whole process itself, how long it takes for someone to get approval, if there is an approval, the whole process itself?
So, so the good news is that right now we do not have any wait to get into our program. Generally speaking, it does take about 2 weeks or so to get an assessment scheduled. But we do not, we have immediate openings for treatment once you've been assessed. And so, so once an individual has been assessed, then are we referring to the length of treatment or just the length to get into the
Well, I'm gonna let you discuss the whole process, because I think sometimes when families are looking for answer, and then they reach out to an organization or a center, let's say they want to know, like, okay, well, how long this is gonna take me. So just for people to have an idea.
Okay. So it really depends, again, on what individuals are referred to. So as I mentioned, we have our partial hospitalization program for those kids that are medically compromised. And so that generally, the stay in that program tends to be about 4 to 6 weeks. And then individuals transfer into outpatient. Once in outpatient, whether you're stepping down from the PHP, or if you're coming in directly to outpatient and skipping PHP, it takes about 9 months to a year in order to be 100% cured from the eating disorder. And that's because we take a very specific approach here, which is known as family-based treatment. It is the only evidence-based treatment that there is for eating disorders. And so it puts the parents in charge of refeeding their child and interrupting eating disorder behaviors. So parents temporarily take over full control until the adolescent or child is in a place where they can resume some control under supervision over their eating. And eventually we look, obviously, to move the individual back to where they were at their baseline. So completely independent. So because of that entire sort of trajectory, the treatment length is about 9 months, 9 to 12 months on average.
Awesome. Thank you very much for, clarifying that information. Yeah, thank you, thank you. And Megan, any cost?
Cost.
Yeah.
So we do take, we take all the major insurance companies. So it would just be whatever is typical for your insurance, meaning that if you have a copay, you would probably have to pay the copay. Most, I would say, insurance companies cover it at 100%, most. So obviously you'd have to look into your specific insurance. We do that here as well. We will check on your benefits, but to check your benefits to see what is covered, but generally speaking, it is covered.
And Megan, let's go over contact information. I know that you put the contact information right there. Do you want me to read it or you want to read it, the phone number or all of that?
Sure. So if you, again, our main number, so where you will be able to access someone who can do your phone assessment would be 908-522-5757. And again, at that point, we will schedule a phone assessment. Usually the phone assessments are done within 24 hours of initial contact. And then we proceed from there. Up above, I have the link to at the very top, I have the link to our website. So that has more information about our center and the treatment that we do here, as well as goes over some of the things that I discussed here today, such as signs and symptoms.
And like I said before, all the contact information, all of that is going to be right there, right below this video. So if you guys have any questions, the website, everything is going to be there. And we are almost moving to the Q&A session. But before we do that, Megan, any final thoughts that you would like to share with us in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely during COVID, we saw a huge uptick in individuals who were presenting with eating disorders, and so much so that it really flooded and overwhelmed the systems. I think we're finally starting to see it come back down as kind of individuals have returned to normal life. But I think just to be sort of on alert, because I think that now that we've moved into sort of this, well, my child was so they were out of school for a period of time and they were really limited on their social activities. So I think there's some reluctance to take a child out of school again, or even, change any of disrupt their current routine. So I think it just means staying hyper vigilant that these issues are very much still there. And that we need to be on alert. And if you have any concerns, if you have any reason to suspect that something is going on, really to use that sort of gut intuition and to make a referral.
Thank you very much. And Megan, as I mentioned at the beginning, on behalf of Family Partners, thank you very much for doing this Lunch and Learn for us and our community, and also to every single person for joining us. So thank you very much. We're going to conclude this part and we're going to move to a Q&A session. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.